I'm just going to talk about the state of wilderness in New Zealand. That name takes its name after the last sort of serious bit of work that Department of Conservation did on wilderness, which was back in 2001, and they released a report on the state of wilderness in New Zealand. A lot of it was dealing with human impacts. Sadly, there was probably just 2 or 3 paragraphs about what was going on with biodiversity in those areas, and I think that's largely because we haven't been in there to have a look and see what's going on there. So in this presentation, I'm going to also have a little kicking at some of the legs that hold up our wilderness policy in New Zealand, or our thinking around wilderness, and just see if they handle that. Okay, so a quick definition of wilderness. Whenever you read anything that tries to give a definition of wilderness, it sort of says that wilderness values or wild values aren't easily defined. That's usually the opening sentence. And so it sort of ranges from everything for some people visiting New Zealand, if they haven't got Wi-Fi access, it's a wilderness experience, right through to people that want a very pure experience of not even wanting to see anyone else or any other parties. And it's pretty much everything in between. But probably the best definition I think I ever heard of what wilderness means is if you can try and imagine a group of trampers walking up a wild West Coast river, in this case the Karamea, one of the great sort of wilderness adventures in New Zealand is to raft down the Karamea. And a group of trampers are walking up along the side of that, and they see helicopters going in with kayaks along the side. And the kayakers or rafters are flying in, 3 loads back and forth over half an hour. You know, one of the trampers sort of bloody kayakers, affecting my wilderness experience. It'll be the one in a knitted jersey saying that. And the kayakers don't care. They use helicopters all the time to access these sort of places. It doesn't affect their wilderness experience, because once they get there and the helicopter flies away, they're left with this amazing wild piece of water with no human influence at all, and it's just them and the river. And they're paddling down, having this totally wild experience. And then they get to a little gorge and they burst through the gorge and they look up and they see a tramper's swing bridge. They go, bloody tramper's swing bridge affecting my wilderness experience. And that's probably the best definition I've ever heard of wilderness and wild values. And from that simple definition, any park managers here should be able to come up with simple policies that please everyone. So it's sort of unclear whether we actually have a wilderness policy in New Zealand. Some people say there's not currently an up-to-date one, and it's sitting in abeyance with the Planning Department at DOC. Other people say that the 1985 policy is still current. But we've had wilderness in our National Parks Act since 1952, and it's sort of spread around general policies and individual management plans, but I think overall we don't actually have an up-to-date wilderness policy at the moment. We have, I think, 8 gazetted wilderness areas. They're quite large. It's got one big one in the North Island, Raukumaras, up near East Coast. We've got Tasman, of course, and Kahurangi National Park, which is a huge wilderness area. The 2 most recent ones we gazetted were the Adams and the Paparoa on the west coast, Hooker Landsborough, the Olivines, 2 in Fiordland with the Glasnock and Pembroke. There were some other smaller ones, but I think they've actually been decommissioned because they don't, or degazetted because they don't fit the policy. And the policy basically revolves around things like no landings, no huts and tracks, buffer zones. So there's a whole bunch of things there that define wilderness in a New Zealand context. And it's usually large, unmodified areas, visiting there as nature on nature's terms. So I just thought I'd put this up because it's interesting to look back at where our wilderness policy came from, and a lot of the driver for it came in the 1970s with people like Les Malloy, who were involved with FMC at the time, and a lot of it was a response to what the Forest Service was doing, and that they were cutting down 500-year-old rimu trees, sawing them up and building huts. So it's kind of understandable, but it was, in many ways, it was a bit of an unfair reaction against the Forest Service. You know, in some ways I look back at the Forest Service and think, well, actually they were an okay organisation and they did some pretty good things for recreation and management, and it was nice to have an organisation that was actually a field service with lots of rangers out in the field all the time that knew how to take care of themselves out in the wilds. But that's where some of it came from. There were also places like the Roakumaras, they wanted to dam the Motu, so I guess it was felt that putting a wilderness area there was a way to stop that, and it was effective. There were all sorts of other threats like roads going through, you know, the Tasman wilderness area, roads going through the olivine areas, so it was also seen as a mechanism to try and, you know, head off some of those developments. So that was all good. And of course the big thing was quiet enjoyment. Well, every time I've gone into a wilderness area, I think wilderness areas, they give you these sort of road to Damascus sort of experiences, and by and large, most of the times I've visited wilderness areas, I've had that reaffirmed. Except back in 2012, 2013, I was involved in a filming project where we went into the olivines and spent 3 weeks in the olivines, and we got permission to fly in there, which was controversial at the time. But DOC used the opportunity to actually send one of their staff in, which was great, because they could actually have a good look around as well. And to be honest, my road to Damascus experience there was, I was shocked how little wildlife was in the olivines. So we spent 3 weeks there. I think we saw one kea, we heard 2 more, and we saw 1 rock wren in 3 weeks. And I was there with Jeff Spearpoint, and Jeff had been going in there for 40 years, and he was shocked as well. So our thought was, well, what are we doing here? Are we just protecting nice scenery with no flights and no huts and tracks? But we've actually lost, you know, what are some of the real key wild values, which is being able to hear kea and see blue duck in the rivers. And so one of the places we camped at for a couple of days was the Joe River. So it's just an amazingly wild place, the Joe. So if you know the Dart River, you go over the Barrier Range and you drop straight into the Joe. So, you know, massive cliffs, which you would think would be perfect for nesting grounds for kea, and there'd be flocks of them in there. The first day we camped there, we packed up all our tents and stowed them because we thought we didn't want the keas getting into them. The second day we didn't bother because there was none around. And that's from the Barrier Range looking into Destiny Ridge. So the Joe's down in that valley, and out of the Joe, Destiny Ridge climbs about 1,300 metres up onto the Destiny Ridge, which drops you into the Olivine Ice Plateau. And there's an enormous face there with rock boulders for Africa. It's a huge place. And you would think there would be lots of rock wren there. It looks like ideal habitat. And Jeff and I spent 2 days walking around there while the others were doing their filming, and we saw 1. And that was it. So they become quiet, these places, all right? They're dead. You've got more chance of seeing wildlife in the Rootburn or the Matukituki Valley, where we are actually doing pest control. So that's a reality check. So in the places where we've got more people, more activity, we've got pest control programs going on. So our wilderness areas, in my view, have become areas of non-management. We draw a big ring around them and go, we just haven't got the resources to do anything about that, so we're just going to leave them to die. And that's what's happening. And if you talk to one of DOC's lead scientists, Graham Elliott, he will say exactly the same things going on in the Tasman wilderness area, and that you've got more chance of seeing FEO where the volunteers are doing all the work in the Flora tablelands area. So I'm not arguing necessarily that we should change how we think about huts and tracks in these areas or change how we think about landings in these areas. But I wish that people would be more passionate about what the reality is in these places, as opposed to whether there's the odd landing or there's the odd incursion with a hut and track or whatever. I think we're directing our passions in the wrong place at the moment. And it's the same for park managers. I think there's a lot that will get fired up about landings, and I want them to be fired up about the fact that there's no bird life in some of these places. So our non-policy, because I'm not sure we even have a wilderness policy at the moment, does talk about biodiversity values, but we've failed on that. And I'm just throwing these sort of questions out there and thinking, what are the solutions? I don't have any solutions to some of these things at the moment, because a lot of them require money to do. Things like pest control in the olivines involves big flight times and serious cash to be put towards it. And because there's not a lot of, I guess, commercial sort of things going on there, that sort of partnership type thing that we've talked about is maybe not going to cut it there. It does actually need serious funding. Or we look at ramping up the, some of the things that are going on in other places, and that somehow frees up money for the Department of Conservation to at the very least get in there and do some surveys, find out what's going on, and then look at trying to put some plans in place for pest control. And I think as a society also the old policy actually has a definite point of not promoting wilderness areas, and I think that's a big mistake as well. And I think as a society we've become quite confused about what we're doing with wilderness areas. On one level, we don't want to promote them, we want to keep them as pure recreation areas. In some other documents you'll read this, that somehow New Zealanders are supposed to get behind wilderness areas and think that they're culturally a fantastic concept and we should be doing this. And I don't know how you're going to, like, to me, if we just flick back, those two statements that you'll read in various bits of policy or plans are nonsensical to me. Either we do promote them and celebrate them and work out how we're going to do that, or we're not going to get the support behind doing the work that needs to be done in there. So here's a good example, Paparoa Wilderness Area. If you walked into the Paparoa Visitor Centre, you wouldn't know it existed. And there's virtually nowhere else you'd actually find where it existed as well. So Paparoa is a place that needs a lot of goat control. It's getting a little bit, but it needs a lot more. As far as other pest control in there, I don't think a lot's going on. So how you're protecting great spots and those sorts of things, I'm not sure. So again, I think we're failing there. So whatever sort of wilderness policy we've got, I don't think it's sustainable to just say that we rope off these areas and try and magically people will go and visit them and that will create some good feeling in the community, and from that money will flow and good, will restore these places to how they should be. So I think the case for wilderness has to keep being made. I think it's not enough to just have a few advocates out there that are campaigning for these places. So that's our wilderness areas. That's the main thing that's concerning me. It's not whether there are overflights, it's not whether there are landings or anything else. It's certainly not. We don't have an issue of too many people visiting wilderness areas in New Zealand. I think we've actually got an issue of too little people visiting wilderness areas, and therefore not enough lovers of those lands, I guess, that are out there working to improve them. So I also want to talk a little bit about what I think is a negative of having wilderness areas at one end of the spectrum and our recreational spectrum sort of thinking, is that I think we've tended to think that if you want those sort of values, Then you go to wilderness areas if you want natural quiet, if you want no huts, no tracks, then you go to wilderness areas. But I think what that thinking has led to with park management and management of some of our more popular areas is that we end up diminishing some of those wild values in places where actually people need it the most. And I'm thinking of places like the Milford Track or the Rootburn. It's almost more important there to get values of natural quiet, even being able to leave the hut without telling the warden and go up and sit somewhere quiet in the evening. These days, if you did that in the Milford, you may even set off an alarm. You would certainly come back to a hyperventilating warden that you'd walked off somewhere and not told them that you'd gone anywhere. And to me, that sort of park management is really devaluing why we have these places. And so those sort of common values of wild places and wilderness, there should be in our wilderness policy, those sort of things should be stretching right across all experiences, certainly in national parks and all conservation areas. We even call them wardens as if they're managing a prison. It was nice to see the Canadians call them custodians, which I thought was a far nicer word. So more important for first-time visitors to be exposed to wild values. I think one of the issues that comes up there is, if we have landings, there's been a lot of talk about changing the landings at Mount Cook National Park. To me, I'm relatively comfortable with landings at a place like Empress or Gardner, as long as those 50,000 people walking up the Huka Valley every year are still getting the level of natural quiet they're getting now, which means making sure that whatever happens there, the flight path doesn't affect their experience. Because to me, it's more important that they experience that lovely quiet and silence of looking up at Aoraki from that valley. So I'll just have I'll go into bed again for the Forest Service, because we've also got this thing that the Forest Service destroyed a lot of wilderness by putting huts and tracks everywhere. That was a major driver of our wilderness policy. And I'm not sure that that's entirely fair. I mean, this is the Tohoroa Valley. It's got more huts and tracks than you could shake a stick at. It's still a wonderfully wild place, and it's also a land that has quite a few lovers that, people that go in there and want to care for it. They monitor what's going on there. They tell the bird numbers to DOC. They keep an eye on it. We need more of that happening in wilderness areas. We just got to figure out how to do it. So I think we've just done that. So in the 2001 State of the Wilderness Report, this was actually recognised, and so they went through and said that in other areas we're managing with the Department of Conservation, we'll try and have unaltered natural settings, low impact and experience sensitive facilities, unobtrusive regulatory presence, that's the hut warden thing, minimal parent visitor numbers. And the example they used was the Greenstone Caples, and they sort of celebrated the fact that the Greenstone Caples was relatively unaffected and it held on to these values much nicer than the Rootburn. What's happened in the last 15 years, we've gone and put a big digger through the Greenstone Caples and put big huts in, and we've essentially tried to replicate what's gone on in the Rootburn. So I'm not sure, whatever the status of this report was, I'm not sure it went very far. So just a look at a possible future. As I say, I've got no answers to some of these things. I'm just putting it out there for discussion. But I definitely think we need a society which has a few more lovers of wilderness lands and why we have them. We can't just keep relying on people like Les Malloy to get up and speak passionately about them, or a few people within FMC. We need more than that. Otherwise, I just don't see us convincing the people that need to be convinced that we need more than some obscure 2050 pest-free New Zealand with $28 million attached to it. because that won't do this job. It won't actually restore wilderness areas, let alone make New Zealand pest-free. So I definitely think we need to look at those values that are in wilderness areas, what the priority values are, and that to me is, making sure there's still good populations of kea and rock wren, because the olivines without kea and rock wren is nothing. It's scenery. It's nice mountain scenery. And we need a policy that also talks about extending those sort of values into other places so it runs pretty consistent, so that we don't just have sacrificial lamb areas and then at the other end of the spectrum we have wilderness and whatever happens in between happens in between. It has to be consistent. And just to add another, Raymond Dasman was an early conservationist in California, and I got this out of actually Les's big dissertation on wilderness areas, and he quoted this right at the end, and I think it's actually worth remembering this. Sometimes we create more trouble for ourselves drawing big circles around areas and saying, that's a wilderness area. We destroy some of the magic. But I also recognise the fact that to make the modern world work, you need rules, you need plans, you need things, but if we do that, we've still got to make sure, how do we keep the magic? And I think the key thing is just making sure that in those policies and plans, you really identify what the key values are and then making sure it's consistent. Don't have it where you can walk in the root burn and there's people everywhere, but you've got great bird life in there, good things happening, and then you go over into the olivines where you think you're going to get the same sort of experience, but perhaps a tad wilder, and then it's worse. And that's all I've got to say about wilderness areas in New Zealand and their current status.